Okay, so hello everybody, welcome and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar on Net Zero, the No Net Loss, why carbon markets aren't a good model for investing in nature recovery. So I'm Jess Fredenberg, I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. If you've not joined us before for a webinar and you don't know what AFN is, it's a UKRI funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. So we've got around 3,000 members now across the UK, so please join us if you haven't already. If you ticked to be signed up when you added yourself to this webinar, then you'll start receiving our emails soon. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Alex. I should have asked you, can you please pronounce your very amazing last name for us? Is it Teytelboym? Is that right?
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, Alex Teytelboym is Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford, a Fellow at St Catherine's College, and a Professorial Research Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. He directs the university's Business Economics programme and an MSc in Financial Economics as well. His current research interests lie mainly in market and mechanism design, and he's interested in environmental economics and co-leads the finance theme. I'm going to have to ask you again, Alex, I can never say this, is it Leverhulme?
Leverhulme.
Leverhulme, my God. Okay, the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery. So he advises companies, governments, and NGOs on auction and market design. So, needless to say, Alex knows a thing or two about markets. So I think we're going to really make use of his time with us this morning. So we're running things a little bit differently today to our normal webinars. I've asked Emily Norton, who many of you will know, to be our chair. So I'm going to hand over to her in a second. She's our policy champion on land, and she's also a natural capitals market expert. And I just thought for this topic, we really needed somebody, not me, to chair this, who understood much more about the topic. So she'll really help us get a lot out of it. So Emily and Alex are going to speak for a little bit. They're going to have a sort of discussion. Alex has a few slides as well, and then we'll have our usual 30-minute Q&A afterwards with all of you guys. So if you've got questions as we go along, if you could please put them in the Q&A box, trying to keep the chat just for sort of sharing links and things like that, because there's a lot of you, and it will be easy to lose your questions if you put them in the chat. So put them in the Q&A, and then Emily will be fielding all of those later and putting them to Alex. So Emily, if I hand over to you, and off you go.
Happy days. Thank you so much, Jez, and welcome everybody to this webinar. And thank you, Jez, very much for inviting me to do this with Alex. We've had a fascinating pre-chat around all of these issues that are going on. And I think just kind of like looking through the people who have said hello so far, I know a huge amount of you are sort of deep in the weeds of figuring out mechanisms for nature recovery, all sorts of different organisations represented here. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time at all reminding us all of why investment into nature recovery is absolutely critical. You will all, I'm sure, be at that stage of as I am in various different guises, sort of frustration, I suppose, that the sort of projected wall of demand that we keep getting told about is not manifesting itself at project level. So whether it's landscape recovery or across different sort of forms of carbon markets or nature markets, the sort of theory of them seems pretty good, but the reality of them seems mired in all sorts of different levels of problem. And so what we're going to be doing today with Alex is kind of thinking through maybe a reason why some of those things aren't working quite the way that they could be, and then kind of set out, Alex has got a really amazing case study of how finance can be unlocked. I have got some challenging questions for Alex. However, this is really about everybody kind of the opportunity to air this. And I think with Alex's permission, kind of really also, I think, a little bit challenging the role of private finance in nature and whether we're putting too much expectation on the private sector to be doing this. You know, I'd really like to explore some of those issues as well, with Alex's permission. So I think there's some legitimate questions there that really need answering. So please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, because obviously too much chat. So if you can put them in the Q&A box, I'd be really, really grateful. So in this context, drawing a little bit as experienced policy champion for the AFN Network, 3 policy champions this year, as well as lots of other champions who are all looking at different aspects of the shifts that we need in order to transform the agri-food system. But also I do a variety of other things, as some of you will know, including things like the Environmental Markets Board, which is looking at the governance of nature markets. And so I'm going to be drawing on some of that experience today as well. So enough. Alex, please tell everybody who you are and what you do at the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery.
Thanks so much, Jez, for inviting me. Emily, thanks so much for sharing this. It's really wonderful to be chaired by somebody so knowledgeable. So I'm Alex. I'm an economist. I'm an academic economist, but a lot of what I do, especially in the Leverhulme Centre, which is a new centre devoted to research, interdisciplinary research on nature recovery questions. And what I focus on is how to make markets work for nature. Economists have a lot of evidence that markets can be made to work well in many contexts, but what it requires is very careful design, very careful regulation, a lot of attention being paid to sort of the detail of the market function. And when we get it right, they work miraculously to solve all sorts of problems, in particular environmental problems. So that's sort of something I think I want to convey to the wonderful audience today. And thank you all for joining. It's from all sorts of parts of the world I wasn't expecting.
Okay, thank you. So I love that concept, when we get it right. Hopefully we'll come back to some examples later of where it has been got right, because it doesn't feel yet that we've got very many examples to draw on. But let's start from the beginning anyway. The whole kind of title of this, net zero versus no net loss. Explain that, the principles of carbon markets, which is the net zero bit, and then how that's been kind of a model for the biodiversity net gain markets as well, and perhaps why those things haven't been working quite as well as they should be.
Great. So let's sort of start with net zero and the idea of how to use markets to try to get us to net zero. And the idea is quite old and very well developed, and the problem is the following: companies pollute. They produce things that we want to buy, but in the process of doing so, they produce carbon. And this carbon creates global warming, increases temperatures, and harms everybody else. And what economists point out is if you have no incentive to reduce the pollutant, there will be too much of the pollutant. So what can one do? Basically, you have one option. It's kind of in a narrow economic way. You have to price it. You have to set a price on carbon that will reflect the cost to society of this carbon. So it's true for all sorts of forms of pollution. Carbon is just one manifestation of this. And essentially, there's 2 ways in which you can do this. One is that you can set a tax on carbon, very straightforward. And if you set the tax that is going to reflect the cost of the carbon to society, that's going to appropriately shift the incentives of consumers and producers in a way that will take you from excess production of carbon to an appropriate amount of carbon production. The other way to do it is to say, well, maybe we're not kind of sure exactly what the price should be, but we have a better idea of what the quantity of the carbon we want to get to, and we should let people figure out what the price is. And this is the idea behind the EU emission trading scheme that UK is still essentially part of, and various other emissions trading schemes around the world. And the way it works is very simple. You get some number of permits that allow you to emit carbon. So if you want to emit more than the number of permits that you have to go and buy permits from the market. You go to the market and you buy these permits, and they're called allowances very often. And if you pollute more, you have to buy more permits. And so people buy and sell permits. If you have more permits than you need, you can sell them into the market. If you need to buy more permits, you will go and buy these from the market. And so as people trade these and note the number of permits is set to be some quantity that is smaller than what people would have produced without this regulation. And so somebody is going to have to cut. And so the question is who's going to cut? And so people trade. And the price that comes out in this market is what we would think of as the permit price or the carbon price in this context. So it's a price that comes out of this trading mechanism. And essentially what happens to the polluters is that they now pay, instead of paying the carbon tax, they pay this carbon price that emerges in this market. In fairness, it's a very complicated way of achieving something quite similar that you could have achieved by a carbon tax. And there are interesting reasons why you might use one versus the other. But by and large, the idea, the eventual outcome is pretty similar. You end up paying for polluting. Now, these schemes for carbon and for other things like sulfur dioxide, water pollution, they've been used all over the world to try to regulate pollution in ways that are transparent and effective and sort of have, flexibility, help, direct investment into cleaner forms of production. And because I think they've been so incredibly successful, we've started thinking, where can we move them onto? And one of the things that people have turned their eyes to is biodiversity, and that's where the versus part comes in. So that's where I would talk about no net loss, or net gain perhaps would be even better. So the idea behind this, this idea in the biodiversity context is to say, hey, look, no net loss really says that whenever you harm biodiversity, you harm the natural environment in some way, you should maybe offset it or buy an offset to compensate for the loss that you've caused. And so that creates a market. It says, every time you maybe create a housing development and you destroy some nature, you're going to go and have to offset this damage somewhere else. There's going to be people who will help you do that. They will make sure that, this gets done and it's appropriately accounted for. And in the end, you will have a price that's going to emerge for this. And the quantity here now just says no net loss, right? So maybe, or net gain, or some amount. And there's going to be a price that's going to come out. And so in the context of, say, the biodiversity net gain market we have in the UK, that's essentially the system. So with sort of bells and whistles, but basically that's the system. There is now a price that developers have to pay in order to offset the damage that they cause to biodiversity, natural environment, when they, say, build housing, for example.
Yeah. So in my mind, simple mind, all this is focused on the economic activity, and then working out how you kind of regulate or impose some kind of, say, tax on that activity in order to generate a financial flow, and the financial flow is then somehow kind of placed in nature in order to kind of achieve the outcome. And we can maybe get to that bit in a minute. So this is very much around kind of thinking about the economic activity that's creating the pollutant and working out how you can kind of, manipulate that thing, right? So we know that flow is not necessarily coming back down to nature adequately or at the speed that it should be, and that sometimes this pricing problem is mismatching between what the sort of makes sense at the corporate level or at the economic activity level, and then what makes sense at the nature level, and certainly the scale of investment that's needed in nature in order to kind of repay the ecological debt caused by the economic activity is in total mismatch. And that's this kind of big gap that we've been sort of very aware of that needs to come back into nature. So what's this innovation that you are been thinking about, and how is it going to kind of start to address this kind of flow problem?
So there's kind of two, when it comes to carbon, this system is basically great. And the reason is very simple, is because a ton of carbon, in Cambridgeshire is the same as the ton of carbon in Bergen in terms of how much damage it causes to the whole world, actually, not just kind of locally. And so to an economist, when there is one pollutant that is polluting, in that case carbon, you need one price to be able to regulate it. And we've taken this idea of just having one price and we've transplanted it into biodiversity by saying, well, there is a biodiversity units that are being damaged by, say, this housing developer. And so we need to offset the number of biodiversity units somewhere else. And so that gives you one price for biodiversity. And I think it's obvious to everyone on this call that there's something suspicious about this idea from the start, that even though it makes a lot of sense for carbon, hopefully, it just sort of doesn't quite add up when you think about biodiversity, because somehow in the process of transplanting this idea, you've just said, well, all biodiversity is the same, as just measured in some kind of units. Whereas if you look at Jez's background at the moment on her screen, it's quite clear that there's a lot of stuff going on in a landscape that is not just some mass of nature. You know, these are amazing, interacting, very spatially coordinated components that somehow all need to work together to produce what we might call natural capital, or, you know, biodiversity. And so what you might worry about, and this is, I think, what you're referring to as the gap, Emily, is basically that when developers might destroy something, the cost they end up paying in terms of the units is not properly sort of reflective of what they offset. So it's very difficult to recreate, you know, the exact ecosystem, but you make it even harder for yourself when you turn it, the thing that you have harmed or damaged, into some sort of homogeneous blob of credits that is supposed to get offset somewhere else. And so you lose the sort of interlocking parts, the sort of different, the landscapes that function together by making everything homogeneous. And in particular, what it does is it creates a very bad incentive. So having the single price creates a very bad incentive to try to offset, if you like, at the kind of lowest ecological cost in terms of these units. So note, in both schemes, carbon or biodiversity net gain, the intention is a good one. The intention is to make markets work in order to protect nature. The goal is to limit damage to the environment at the lowest possible cost.
Yeah,
but the question
so it's about this.
Is it done?
Yeah, and so it's about kind of like, and the problem is, because when it's rendered to that kind of simplistic level of these units, the carbon credit, you get these sort of single issue outcomes. The example being, you know, bad woodland creation, because you're looking at kind of carbon to carbon, right? And in the same way as the BNG type model kind of looks at what's been destroyed and then tries to recreate it in the most like reductive way, as opposed to kind of a blended landscape. And actually, I was thinking about what you were saying. Jez's landscape is complicated, but your landscape is really complicated at the micro level. You know, all of the fungi and bacteria and everything that's making that work. We're not reflecting or recreating that when we're doing this kind of very simplistic, here's the credit and the money flow to here's the offset, right? So your idea is around this combinatorial approach.
Yeah.
So perhaps you could go just and explain a little bit about that. And then I think let's then move into your case study, because I think
Great.
it will really help people understand.
Perfect. So at a very high level, the idea that I'm sort of maybe suggesting is to try and use something that is a bit more sophisticated than having a single price. And what we want, I hope, you know, people can sort of see, is that we want for a landscape to function well, for ecological function, it needs the appropriate kind of components. And so the idea is very simple. If there is public funds in order to create, say, new habitats and new ecosystems, we need to think carefully about not just a price, but exactly which landowner is paid how much at a landscape level. So it might very well be that, you know, three landowners who are next to each other, who are taking a particularly good environmental action, should be compensated together, even though they might seem expensive at a pure cost level, because the ecological value of several coordinated components at a landscape level is so ecologically valuable. Remember, we want to achieve as much ecological benefit at the least cost, but we care about the ecological benefit. So if the ecological benefit is often coming from the fact that things are concentrated and interlocking and adjacent and so on, we need to reward it in some way, right? And so we can't have a single price, because that does not say who should be paid what. And so the idea is to use auction-like mechanisms to direct, you know, to make sure that the winners of these auctions for perhaps government subsidies, or it could be for private finance, but to make sure that the winners of these auctions are people who are delivering together as a combination, that's the word combinatorial, as a combination, they deliver the most ecological value per pound.
So these
Abstract.
auctions are quite common already, are they? They're quite
Absolutely.
a kind of a well-known concept. So telecoms, other things which are kind of bundled together, people have sort of solved. And I was trying to explain this to my son last night. I was kind of like, when you go to like the local sales, like, and we've got a local auction house, and you get like the tray that's full of like old crockery, and you kind of like, there's all sorts of rubbish in there, but there also might be one really, really good thing that people really value above all of the others. But you buy the whole thing and you bid on the whole thing, right? Even though it's got lots of different things in there. Just different people might be or might value the different items within that collection, that lot, differently. And so this is all about how you sort of like bundling together all of these different things of value, some of which are kind of easily monetized or easily viewed, and other things which are kind of incidental or there anyway, in order to kind of get a good price discovery on that. So yes, I think I've understood hopefully, and you just nodded and said that was okay. So hopefully that all makes sense, right? Now let's give this case study, if you can, of where this has worked for you guys, because I think it really kind of helps to kind of explain how it can actually work in practice for nature. So have you got your slides?
I got some slides. So just to come back to your example, you know,
Okay.
you might go to a sort of an auction and say, you know, you need a fork, a knife, and a spoon. Because otherwise you can't have dinner. But maybe Jez is selling the fork and I'm selling the knife and the spoon. You kind of need to buy all of them to be able to go and have dinner. This is going to be the same idea here, except that you're going to be DEFRA and we are going to be landowners with very important ecosystems together. But that's exactly the idea. So you've got the analogy exactly right. So I hope people can see it. So this is a project we did with RSPB in Norfolk and Suffolk, and I saw there were some people in Norfolk and Suffolk here with my wonderful colleagues Elizabeth Baldwin and Paul Klemperer, and our student Chris Harland has been helping us with some of the analysis. So the objective here was to protect turtle doves, okay? And I don't think I need to tell this audience here why turtle doves are wonderful and why we should protect them. They're obviously endangered. They've been endangered for a long time. And we wanted to use auctions to create habitats and ecosystems to try and help them. So here is what sort of happened in this auction at a very high level. Turtle doves need three things, a bit like Emily does when she has dinner. The turtle doves need scrub, which is, you know, sort of nesting habitat, usually looks like hedgerows. They need water to drink, unsurprisingly, and that can come from ponds and sort of accessible rivers. And they need food, which is essentially the kind of the seed mix. And the key thing is that these things need to be close to one another. So they all need to be within a certain distance. In particular, when turtle doves come and they breed, the little chicks can't travel too far to, you know, have the seed mix or to the water, or they might perish. And so all of these things need to be sufficiently close to one another to be useful to the little turtle doves that breed in England. And so the closer the better, basically. But, you know, if things are a bit further apart, maybe they deliver a bit less ecological value. So now what we want to procure these three things at once, but they might all be, you know, on different people's lands, and they might all be, you know, different parts of different people's land. So how are we going to sort of use an auction-like mechanism? So the idea is kind of pretty straightforward. And I should say the ecology of this is very complicated. You sort of want things to be clustered, but you want the clusters to be spread out. And we worked with RSPB to figure out is sort of what is the best possible configuration that you can get. And then sort of work of that is we can't get the best possible configuration. What is, you know, the next best thing and so on, given the budget that we had. So here's how a combinatorial auction works. I imagine most people have an idea of what an auction works. Remember, this is a procurement auction in this case. The government, in this case, DEFRA, used its funds to try and pay farmers to take certain actions that's going to help turtle doves with RSPB's help. So what we want is people to get as low cost as possible, the kind of the biggest bang for buck from the government's perspective. I'm sure if you're a landowner joining, you might think about it in the opposite way, but for sure the government wants to get the most bang for its buck, ecological bang. So the idea is the following. We have some features of the landscape in the, there might be a river somewhere that's just already there, and people can even create their own ponds, so they can submit different actions into this combinatorial auction, and they might also indicate, and they do this all on the website, on a map, where their scrub is, and they can indicate their own scrub and their neighbor's scrub and so on. And finally, what they commit to doing is to cover some of their fields with seed mix at an appropriate time in the year, and they would say how much they need to be paid to do this. So you can see maybe at the top left, this landowner drew their field on the map. This is, you just draw it literally on the map, and you say, I'm going to put the seed mix here, and I would like to be paid £100. Okay, the numbers are completely made up in this case. So what do we do? What happens in a combinatorial auction? We get all these bids from different landowners, and we evaluate any possible combination of them together. So we say, okay, well, maybe these two bids on the, at the top left, what are they worth in terms of ecology, right? So we have to kind of think about what is going to be the ecological outcome. Now, if you look at this map I've created over here, the two cheapest bids are £7 and £48, and maybe these are the ones you might want to take if you didn't care about ecological value. But once you take all the features into account, the scrub and the river and the adjacency of the different food plots, you might actually conclude that the winning bids are completely different, because they will deliver most ecological bang for buck. And here our objective, we created a unit which we called Turtle Dove Happiness, which we abbreviate to TDA. And so we're trying to get as many TDAs per pound as we possibly can. And maybe in this particular example, what we want to do is actually take quite expensive bids because they deliver so much ecological value per pound. And so we had this very complicated, ecological model in the background working at the back of this auction to try and figure out who should be a winner in this auction. And the thing I want to stress is that the winners of this auction are not necessarily people who put in the lowest bids. The people who won in this auction are the people who, in combination with their neighbors, perhaps, and with other bidders, delivered the most ecological value per pound. And this can be in this case, the ecological model was very, very complicated. And so this is where it took place, just in case anybody is from there. It would be wonderful if people, if somebody actually was in the auction, and maybe you can indicate this in the chat, or if anybody lives in these areas, it would be wonderful to know that too, so you can see sort of Norfolk and Suffolk. And we ran 2 of these auctions a few years ago as a pilot to sort of show how this worked. And here are some results. We had a bunch of bids from each one. You can see the bids were actually quite large, and the people were paid, the landowners were paid quite substantial amounts of money, quite a bit above actually what you might get from alternative schemes. But remember, we're not here just comparing cost to cost. We're trying to compare ecological value per pound to ecological value. And the hope was that by having coordinated bids, you could actually justify paying farmers much more, because they would be delivering much more ecological benefits in this case. So people were actually being paid, I think, quite substantial sums for the actions that they were taking, but this can be justified by having greater ecological value that was delivered within the auction budget that we were given by DEFRA. And so just to show the last map, this is the kind of bids we would see. So the green is the scrub and the red is the food, and the little blue dots are the sort of the ponds that people have promised to create. So you get all these bids, and you have to evaluate them all in any possible combination. There's a lot of computation that needs to be done, and in the end you say, ta-da, here are the winners given the budget that we've got. And so we ran 2 of these auctions to show the government that this really can be done, and this idea can be scaled quite a bit to other places. I just saw Douglas asking about whether this is happening in Scotland. I think this was the first time in human history somebody has used a combinatorial auction for ecosystem creation, and unless somebody else has done it in Scotland, because we haven't, then I don't think it's been done in Scotland at all. So that's it. So that you can read about it in and in the FT or the Economist or something like that. And so that's it. That's kind of my story, I guess.
Brilliant.
Was that clear enough?
That's really good. I have questions, and so do the audience, which is really
Fantastic.
good. And thankfully, we're kind of aligned. So I think completely get it. In this situation, it was government who was paying ecological value. So it was
That's right.
EFRA who was underwriting that scheme, yeah?
That's exactly right. So this was during the ELM test and trials phase when the government was suddenly very interested in innovative approaches to kind of post-Brexit um, payments to landowners to try and create an alternative to the common agricultural policy. And as part of that, they were trying to use kind of innovative designs, and we were one of the ones that were selected.
And so this kind of then links into another question, which is from Chris Waterfield. He said, has anybody thought that voluntary biodiversity markets might provide a more competitive market mechanism rather than compliance markets, or in this situation, a government-derived market? At the moment, a developer only has to restore plus 10% in the voluntary woodland carbon market. We are seeing charismatic carbon that provides carbon and water and biodiversity and community and economic sector, et cetera, that far outweighs that 10% benefit that BNG provides. But I think this question around voluntary biodiversity markets, can they be trusted to pay for full ecological value, or are they going to be using this mechanism in order to derive lowest price? And is that necessarily incompatible?
It's a great question. So note here, it doesn't really matter who the money comes from. So if the money came from some voluntary carbon scheme, great. The question is, how is the market organized? That's a key point. So we can discuss whether or not a voluntary carbon market, voluntary biodiversity market is a good idea relative to a compliance market. And I have some views on that. But what I'm trying to suggest is almost sort of orthogonal to this, because who pays in this case is not the relevant thing. Obviously, the more money, the better, because then you can pay more farmers. And that's actually, I think, the key difference between compliance and voluntary. Ultimately, there just isn't enough funds from a voluntary market. The reason why we need a compliance market, I think, is because we can scale this and we can make sure that we have enough coverage and enough funds. But it's not just about the amount of money. What I'm trying to suggest is that the way we use the money that we have, because in the end, we have money from developers that's coming from, say, the BNG. So that's some pot of cash that is just there because things get built. The problem is how we use it. And what I'm suggesting is that the way we use the money is perhaps not actually restoring the ecology in the way that we hope, which is, maybe 1-for-1 or plus 10% or something. Maybe we actually lose while we think we're gaining 10%. That's my concern.
Yeah.
And I would rather that we actually get the 10% we hope we're getting.
Yeah, okay. So I think the other element of this then that the other people as well have picked up on is around there's sort of two elements of it. One is information asymmetry, and the other is kind of the complexity of the algorithm within all of this, and whether how much information bidders have. So question here from Chris Shaw: if the economic algorithm is complicated, the bidders are really in the dark in terms of calculating their bid. Might this undermine their ability to deliver? So let's think about it from the bidder's perspective, but also I think then the information asymmetry from the farmer's perspective is the other element I'd like to get to. So perhaps do that bit first. The bidders are really,
Magnificent question. I mean, really first order. So it is complicated. So the way that we often think about how do you design a good market is the one that makes it easy for the bidder to bid their cost or something that is, maybe a bit higher than their cost that they think is reasonable. So here, in a way, because it's so complicated, it makes it quite difficult to try and get too clever and too strategic. We want to avoid cases in which a landowner would try to strategize. And here, it's very hard to strategize, in part because whether or not you win depends on, what other farmers are bidding in a pretty complicated way. So even though we gave farmers a lot of guidance to try and say, look, if you locate your food bid next to the scrub, that's going to make you more likely to win. If you put, as I said, things being closer is always good. So that you can sort of say with some certainty. But in the end, you can't really say, look, you're going to win, because it really does depend on who else is bidding next to you and what they're bidding and what their landscape looks like. So in some sense, it does put the landowners in the dark, and that might be frustrating. And the feedback we got was certainly frustration. But as an auction designer, somebody who designs markets, I think annoying your participants is actually often a good thing, because then you think, okay, well, they're not able to just sort of take that money and do very little with it. They are actually, bidding in an aggressive, competitive way, trying to deliver some value. And I know if you're a landowner, that would be frustrating. But if you think about it from a public funds point of view, you do sort of want to get that sense of, competition and value for money. But the question is exactly right. It is going to be tricky, but I think this is just the nature of more complex markets like that.
Okay, so there's a lot of complexity in this stuff, and we're trying to manage complexity through simple mechanisms that kind of address complexity whilst also being simple. So there's always this massive trade-off. But I think there's a really interesting question here, which speaks to kind of the human, economic, arguably capitalist approach of trying to intervene in stuff, spending a lot of time worrying about price and less about kind of the underlying systems that sustain biodiversity. And the question is simply, do we agree that by encouraging small farms to farm organically and biodynamically, we will maximize biodiversity? So in other words, should we just be encouraging a land management approach that isn't extractive, is providing space for nature, is by its very definition kind of creating space for biodiversity to exist, rather than sort of driving our brains through sort of complicated hoops to kind of find mechanisms to leverage cash from polluters? Discuss.
Great. So I think we need to get the incentives right. And, I think relying on the most well-meaning landowners to do the right thing without appropriate incentives is not going to deliver biodiversity recovery and nature recovery at scale. So as an economist, what I think about all the time is, what are the incentives? Now, typically they're going to be financial and monetary incentives. I agree. There are other incentives, of course, at play here. And note here, actually, this kind of approach that I'm suggesting is very community-based. Note that if you're doing something good and your neighbor is doing something good, that makes you both more likely to win. And so unusually for an auction, we're encouraging collaboration. We're encouraging people to come together as communities to do things together at the landscape level. So, of course, I think, well, maybe of course, but at least to me, it's an of course. But I think the monetary incentive is going to be important. Ultimately, the landowners we often engage with, a lot of them are commercial. They're going to pay attention to what is the opportunity cost. What is the alternative to doing biodiversity? Is it, growing things? Is it cattle, etc.? We need to make sure that the choices they're making are going to reflect the benefits and the costs to society at large, right? And so, while I, agree that we can wish that people were doing more things, the evidence is that incentives, monetary incentives, do work, but they do need to be carefully created. If I may give you one example, outside of our country, in the United States, which had a horrific decline in wetlands since the Second World War because of huge infrastructure creation. And these precious, beautiful wetlands were being destroyed at an extraordinary pace. And what they implemented was a system not that different to what we have as BNG. So the idea was kind of very simple. If you're going to be creating a housing development on marginal wetland, you're going to have to offset that wetland in the same location. It has probably been the most successful biodiversity recovery policy ever implemented. This market is worth billions of dollars a year, and it stopped the loss of wetlands in the United States. Essentially, in the early Bush years, the amount of wetlands went up, which is just remarkable, right? Now, there's all sorts of caveats about the quality of the wetlands that were restored, and I accept all of those. But if you compare the pace of loss to what is happening right now, it is, night and day. So we know that incentives, we have so much evidence that incentives can work, but I think they need to be carefully thought through.
Okay, so that's the protection of an ecosystem through the monetary value. But is there a risk that in looking at keystone species, like, you know, turtle dove as an element, like what is the governance mechanism that ensures that by thinking about that one species, you are thinking about the kind of the totality of the ecological impact of kind of prioritizing one species over any other? And that kind of activity fits within that broader landscape scale viability and existence. Like what works within the model?
That's a brilliant question. So the turtle doves is supposed to be an example. It's supposed to get you to show up to the seminar, I think. And it was a way for us to say, we all agree that turtle doves are wonderful. So let's, just kind of imagine we want to get as many turtle doves as possible. Okay. And it's really not about turtle doves, right? It's about the fact that many species function in ecosystems, and these ecosystems have interlocking components, and they need to be connected and need to be spatially coordinated. I think, if I may speak for RSPB, even though they have an entire project devoted to turtle doves called Operation Turtle Dove, which is an amazing project in that part of the country, they themselves saw this as a broader way of trying to restore bird species in the country. Because these things that we are doing for turtle doves are just as good for pretty much any other bird species. Now, we wanted to show that even if you created an extremely complex ecological model that was targeted at turtle doves, that it can still be made to work, right? So we made it as difficult for ourselves as possible. But of course, if you were to scale this, you've got to think much more broadly. How much do you want to devote to, restoring bird habitats? How much do you want to devote to, say, restoring wetlands or grasslands and so on? And that's a choice for the government. But I think what they shouldn't do, or maybe they should move away from, I think they should continue doing BNG, but it's just think about reforming it from something that just commodifies all nature into one unit. And I think that is a flawed way of thinking about it. It is much better to think about it as nature, as being heterogeneous. Now, exactly what it is, I think, is up to landowners, it's up to local councils, it's up to the government, and so on. This is a societal decision. But I don't think society would choose, if it could, to say one unit of nature here is like another unit of nature here. That seems to be too much commodification. In your words, that's maybe too capitalistic, right? But markets can deliver other types of outcomes, and this is an example of one.
Okay, we have got heaps of questions. I'm trying to pay attention to them all. There's 44 individual questions, and I'm not going to get to all of them, so forgive me because I can't listen and read perfectly at the same time. So Alex, you're doing brilliantly. Thank you for your it's clearly a huge amount of information to take on. So focus now on kind of how successful the scheme was at delivering outcomes at farm level. So a little bit around sort of on the ground governance. What were the farmers signing up to? How long was it being monitored for? And then also, has it been successful in delivering turtle dove outcomes?
So, as I said, just starting at the back, we were never really trying to measure success by counting the number of turtle doves. The number of turtle doves in this country has plummeted by over 95%, maybe 99% over the last 30 years. It has been a complete disaster. So there are very few of them. If you have seen a turtle dove in this country, you should count yourself as lucky. I think more people have seen the late Queen than they had seen a turtle dove. So it's a very, these things are very rare. Really, I think RSPB was thinking about it from a broader support for bird habitats, while making this about sort of turtle doves here. In terms of measuring success, I think what we wanted to show that you might get bids that are going to be sort of comparable. We expected them to be higher than for alternative schemes. Remember, farmers had an outside option; they could just get paid for doing similar things from other schemes. And so they were paid more. And so you might say, well, that's not very good value for money. But again, what we wanted to show is that the kind of bids that we're going to get are going to have this sort of spatial coordinated component that is going to be good for ecology. And then some of the things we try to do is to compare for ourselves in our analysis what would have happened if we did not pay attention to the ecology. Would we have got good value for money just by picking the lowest bids? And the answer was basically no. Is that it does make a difference that you actually take the kind of the full ecology into account. Remember, we still need to invent units like our TDAs, right? And so it's it's difficult to express value in terms of TDAs, but there is a way of sort of quantifying these kinds of benefits. So in a way, to us as auction designers, this auction certainly was a success. There were some very interesting things, by the way, that emerged. Just I think maybe just to highlight, I think, to the people here. Note here, we want people who are adjacent, who are neighbors, to bid together. And because they are more valuable as a group, essentially. And people figured that out. Farmers are very smart. And we knew farmers were going to be very smart. And so we expected for this to happen, but it really did happen. That farmers who were together submitted bids, which were in some cases really quite high, because they realized that they're going to deliver a lot of value. In a nefarious way, you might call this collusion, right? But I don't think it was maybe so nefarious. People go to the pub together. They say, I'm going to be bidding in this auction. Are you? So yes, I am. Well, okay, good, And then you sort of think, okay, maybe I'll kind of submit a bid that's a little bit higher. But we expected this to happen because we almost encouraged farmers to do it. And so you might say, how do you actually create enough competition and value for money in this kind of context when we're encouraging people essentially to coordinate their bids, right? Or to make bids that are nearby more valuable. And the idea was to actually run this auction in several parts in both Norfolk and Suffolk at the same time to make sure that, we create competition across the clusters, right? So don't think each bidder is competing against all the other bidders. It's really a cluster of bidders competing against another cluster of bidders. It's kind of back to village football. It's sort of, 10 farmers together versus another 10 farmers. That's where the competition's coming from.
Yeah. Was it distributed a bit? Was the money distributed, the payments to farmers distributed like, say, Countryside Stewardship? Was it like a 5-year agreement that they were signing up for?
Sorry, I should have answered that. So it was a 2-year agreement that you were signing up for, and the money was distributed by our SPB. Exactly, it was a payers bid auction. So if you won in this auction, you would be paid exactly your bid. I think over the course of the 2 years, if I remember correctly. And that was all made kind of very clear. So you were committing to do this for 2 seasons. Our SPB would come and check. The compliance rate were fantastic. So thank you to the farming community for being sort of so on top of it. Essentially, nobody dropped out. And I think that's also, shows you that that was a metric of success for us, is that people actually delivered what they promised to deliver. It was really superb compliance.
That's great. And it's really, really encouraging to hear, actually, because I know in all of this, we've kind of got to start from where we are. But there's an interesting question here from the Scottish perspective, which actually kind of really resonates for me as well. I asked you this in a pre-question, and I said, is it fair to farmers? And you said, what does fair to farmers even mean? Which I kind of like, but actually the question that Jill Robbie has posed here is kind of a broader question of fairness and equality. So how do you consider the underlying inequality of land ownership when implementing these markets? In Scotland, land is held by only a few people. So there is a risk that these markets make inequality worse as they provide a new source of income for land owners. Are there ways to tackle this through market design? And I would like you to answer that specifically because communities have so much influence over landscapes, not just farmers and landowners. So how do we think about broadening and using these kind of tools that can manage that complexity of lots of different buyers and sellers together to include these ideas of inequality and fairness in who gets to benefit?
This is a wonderful question. So what I kind of hope to convey through the case study is that markets can be made to work even with very complicated objectives. So here our objective was ecology. And the question is really about, well, what about other types of objectives that we care about, like inequality of land ownership and so on? The point is that something like an auction if well designed, can capture these kinds of objectives. So, for example, you can imagine an auction in which tenant farmers, for example, would get an uplift in their bids, right? So whatever they're going to decide to do, we will score their bid to be more valuable and so therefore more likely to win, right? And so you can encode and incorporate these objectives in a pretty transparent way. So, to give you a very dull example, when the government does sell radio spectrum, as you mentioned, if you're a new entrant, you're often going to face less kind of competition. There might be spectrum set aside for you that only the new entrants would compete on, because the government might care about, bringing in new people into, making your mobile phone work very well, not just the incumbents. And so you can do things like that. Now, inequality is at the core of how you think about market design. I mean, the kind of equity concerns come up all the time. And I think we don't pay enough attention to them, actually, in general. But in the same way as we can think about turtle doves, it's a very complicated objective. We can think about very complex objectives related to equity. I dare not speak to the specific context of Scotland, which I don't actually know that well. I know the issue of land ownership. Exactly how it should be fixed, I probably should not speculate on this call, but just to say there are ways of doing it. Auctions are not just about getting people to pay as little as possible for the cheapest possible thing. It's about delivering, value for money, and value can come from all sorts of objectives, including equity.
So I think part of that is this sort of this policy confusion we've got at the moment, which is that government is leaning into nature markets for various different reasons. One of the reasons it's leaning into nature markets is because it's got a nature problem. Another one is because of the farmer income problem, which is sort of post transition away from the common agricultural policy. As we all famously know, food markets don't reward farmers for producing food, or the system is designed in order to ensure that farmers are economically optimizing their output to provide food products to the market, not necessarily in a way that covers the natural capital exploitation costs of doing so. So we're not sort of paying enough into the system in order to kind of restore it and ensure that the externalities are minimized and reduced. And so I suppose this is what concerns me when you said, well, what does fair to farmers even mean? And I suppose, farmers as economic agents are being kind of prioritized within this nature market space, but are doing so against sort of what feels like unfair competition. And a lot of this is about saying, well, how can the corporate pay, I'm going to paraphrase, how can the corporate pay as little as possible for a nature outcome that's deemed to be beneficial, against this backdrop of farmers being economically exploited by a system which says we will buy your produce, but we won't necessarily invest in you. So the auction doesn't really fix that inequality, and unless everybody is on a kind of an equal footing in having enough of a demand side and enough of a supply side equality in order to use these mechanisms to kind of create those outcomes, right? And am I overthinking it? I mean, this strikes me as being the heart of the problem of nature markets. We think they're great, but they're fixing a problem that maybe shouldn't exist.
But it does. So, and we need to fix it. So I think, the idea, and I have heard this, when I've tried to pitch this idea directly to farmers, they said, look, it's just the same old, same old. You're trying to pay us as little as possible for doing this. Why shouldn't it be the other way around? And the reason why we design auctions is actually not just to, pay farmers a little. That's not the intent. The real intent is to reveal their actual costs. The only people who really know how much it costs for them to do certain actions on the land, how much they're going to benefit, are the farmers themselves. And that information we do not have access to. In principle, there is nothing wrong with taxing a corporate a lot and then redistributing some of this money in a way that is not tied to actions, right? And then making some of it dependent on the specific actions that people might be taking. So again, I think, exactly how much of the burden is falling on the polluter and how much of the burden is falling on the restorer is an orthogonal question to exactly how you design, like a kind of a particular incentive scheme like the one I was suggesting, right? And it comes back to a question of equities, who should, on whom the burden should fall. I think that is a crucial, it's a first order question, which is, absolutely important. But, a combinatorial auction would have functioned just as well if we had gone to the farmers, gave them all £100,000 in the start and said, here's £100,000, just have it. And then let's have an auction.
Yeah.
For an extra,
look,
you see what I mean? So, I have absolutely no problem with that. If this is, but that's a separate issue, about overall farming support and how much we prioritize food versus something that is something that's on the landscape, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are so many fascinating questions, and I'm so deeply sorry to all 55 people whose questions we haven't answered yet, or possibly even got to. We're very definitely getting towards the end of our time here. So Alex, if you can, in just like 30 seconds, because Jez has got some messages that she needs to share with the audience as well, just before the end, like your pitch for like who needs to take this seriously in order for this to be successful? Who's your pitch to? Who can make a difference for your idea to unlock it? Like, what needs to happen next?
DEFRA needs to pay attention. Government needs to pay attention. Actually, ultimately, Treasury, Department for Local Communities needs to pay attention. We have funds that we want to use to recover nature. We should not commoditize and commodify nature because that's not going to be a good way of spending money. I would be very grateful for people in their own community groups, in whatever channels they have, to lobby, to write, and to say, we are not using this money very well at the moment. So I have some hope for the Environment Fund that the government has just announced, that it could be used in this way. The way that the Environment Fund is pitched is to say, we want to do things at scale by delivering good value for money. This is a way of doing it. So do get together as a village, for example, and say, we want to be paid together for restoring nature.
Thank you. That was brilliant. My mind has exploded. I'm really looking forward to watching this back and listening to everything that you've said in detail, because I've been trying to read and listen and everything. So thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating, and so many issues in this space that we really need to unlock quite quickly. So thank you for your thought and your effort and your continued work in trying to unlock this on behalf of nature. So thank you. I'm done.
Well done, Emily. Thank you so much. Alex, just to reiterate, it was really fascinating and really well explained. So thank you so much. Emily, well done, because we've had more questions, I think, come in than we've ever had at any webinar. And we've been doing this for 2 years now. So just goes to show like how much of a hot topic it is, and something that people really are still, trying to all understand. So I think what we might try and do, Alex, if it's okay with you, we might try and pick out some of those. We might go back to some of those questions, try and pick some of them out and put them to you, and then we'll write it all up with a summary of the key points from this webinar. If you wouldn't mind, that would be great. But thank you so much for coming. Thanks everybody for all your questions. We will try and post some of those, Alex, again. I've just put some links in the chat. If you wouldn't mind rating this webinar, that would be really helpful. It just takes a couple of minutes. Our funding runs out at the moment. It's due to run out in December. So any help you can give us in terms of rating will help us to put forward the a proposition for continuing this sort of thing. So that would be great. Our next webinar will be in March with the FFCC. We're looking at power in the food system and the impact on farmers. We've then got a webinar with the Climate Change Committee fairly shortly after that on the 7th carbon budget, just digging into that a little bit more. So look out for emails from us. But otherwise, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you all soon. Alex and Emily, thanks so much.